Hey everyone, a friend of mine and fellow producer and composer recently asked me if I would do a video for the channel breaking down how I process drums. I thought that'd be fun and I thought it would be something good for the channel, so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a look at 4 tracks that I've recently produced and what I did to get the drum sound in those tracks. Before we get into the main part of the video, I want to let you know that I have an album coming out on the 1st of December. It's called Soul Trading and you can pre-order it right now on Bandcamp. There are links in the description down below. The first track that we're going to look at is actually from that album and it's called Connected but Part of Something Bigger. So here we are in Ableton Live. This is the project file for the song and let's hear what it sounds like from here. Alright, that gives you an idea of what it sounds like. So, let's take a look at the drums specifically. There's a lot going on, but today we're just looking at drums. So when I start a project file and when I'm starting to program the drums, the first thing that I'll do is set up a MIDI track for the drums. I rarely work with recording live drums in my workflow. It's usually almost always MIDI. And the MIDI drum libraries that I use are from Get Good Drums. You can see here if I open up Kontakt, I have 4 of their One Kit Wonder kits and also the Matt Halpin signature pack. I love their sound, I love how easy they are to work with, so if you're listening to my music, especially recently, it's pretty much almost always Get Good Drum libraries. And for this one, I'm using the Matt Halpin signature pack. So, when I'm setting up the drums, I'll set up this MIDI track and I'll usually just put a little bit of compression on it, and that's what I use to just write the drums. You can see here I have the full piano roll and it's all the elements. Here we have kick, there's snare, there's some cymbals, some ride cymbal, and that kind of sounds like this. You can see I've mapped out the velocities in quite a high degree of detail, and that's because I want to get as human a touch as possible. Now, when I'm writing drum parts, I almost always just use the mouse to click the notes into place, but sometimes I will play certain individual elements on either drum pads or on a keyboard, and that's particularly to get kick and snare patterns in quickly, or to get things like hi-hat articulation in, because I want a natural articulation, and it's quite easy to get that by just using 2 fingers to simulate the 2 hands of the drummer. And that way I get a nice natural change in articulation, in velocity, without having to individually tweak velocity levels, although sometimes I will go back and manually change those after the fact. So once I've written the drum part, and that involves making basic kick and snare patterns, cymbal patterns, it includes having hits to catch parts of the melody. Once I have all of that drum part written out, I then ditch this track where everything is there and bounce it out into this full thing. As you can see, it was turned on because we were listening to it, but this track here, Kit, is just there while I'm writing. For the actual sound, we're using this group of tracks with each individual element of the drum kit. And we can take a listen to the difference between those two. Let's take a listen here. So this is the original with everything. And then let's take a listen to what it sounds like once all those individual drum elements have been processed separately. And you can hear there that that is much clearer because I'm able to tweak the individual elements of the drum kit. How do I do that? Well, I just copy and paste that exact same MIDI information across to a bunch of different tracks. One of the reasons I like Get Good Drums so much is because it's very easy to individually solo out the elements. So let's take a look first at the kick track. It sounds like this. And if I go into the MIDI, you can see that what I've done is I've gone into the mixing element of the plugin, and there are all these individual elements. We've got kick, snare, toms, cymbals, and you can see here I've got the kick, and I've just soloed the kick's individual mic. I've not even included the overhead and the room mics, and I'll get to that in a second. So that's the kick, and I've done the same for all the different elements. The snare, you can see I have this top and bottom together, but if I wanted to do this separately, I could. And then the same for the toms, I put all in one track. So I've just, if we go over to toms here, toms, I've soloed rack tom 1, 2, and 2 floor toms as well. And for the cymbals, I've soloed the individual cymbal mics for the splashes, the mini hats, the stack, the ride, etc. And then for the overheads, what I do is I go in and solo the overhead mic from each drum element. Kick, snare, toms, and then the cymbals. And then also for the room, I do the same thing and solo the room mic for each element. So you can see here, this is the kick room mic, the snare room mic. So I have kick, snare, toms, cymbals, overheads, and room. And you can hear everything going to the overhead like this. It's kind of like an approximation of the whole kit. And then the drum room. So I can get the individual kit elements processed and also still have those overheads and rooms to process individually. So let's take a look at what I do to some of those individual elements. Here on the kick, I have a bit of compression. I have an EQ on the kick. And here I'm scooping out some of this mid-range and cutting some of the high end. I have a bit of low end boosted to get the kick to kind of punch through on that low end. And I also have this area at about 1.3K. I have a bit of boost there. And we can hear that. If I just hold this, we can solo that area of the frequency spectrum. It sounds like this. And that's the area of the frequency spectrum where the attack of the kick is hitting. So that sound of the mallet against the skin. And the reason I have that boosted is just so the kick cuts through a little bit more. And to help achieve that, I sidechain the bass to the kick. We can see that here I have a multi-band compressor on the bass track. And so that every time the kick is triggered, it cuts out the low end of the bass and also cuts out this area where the attack is coming through. And I include that sidechain on the bass, especially for the low end, but also on most other elements. I have the low end of the kick cutting out the low end of other tracks so that it's always really clean, doesn't muddy up the low end. And I also have that attack frequency area cutting in other tracks as well so that the kick always cuts through nice and clear. Now let's take a look at the snare. For the snare, I have a similar compression and I have some EQ here, just cutting out all the low end so there's no boom on the snare, cutting out a bit of high end so that it's not too ringy, and I've isolated some resonant frequencies on the snare and cut those out so that it's not ringing out and interfering with the frequency spectrum at all. On my toms, I have a similar thing, but because the toms are low and boomy, and especially on some of these Get Good Drums sample libraries where they have the mic right up next to the kit, you get a lot of boom from the skin resonating. So I like to really go in and make sure I'm not having any resonant frequencies on the toms. You can hear what that sounds like here. And if I get rid of that, you can really hear the boom. Take a listen. Probably need good headphones or speakers to be able to hear that boom, but I can hear it quite clearly and it is going to completely muddy up the low end. So I have 2 EQs here just to cut out all of those resonant frequencies. And one of the things I do to save a bit of time is, I know I use this drum kit library a lot, so I have GGD Halpin Toms EQ saved so that whenever I use this kit, all I need to do is just go into my audio effects, search GGD, and there it is, Halpin Toms EQ. So I can just copy and paste that, drop it in whenever I use this kit, and I know that I'm always going to be cutting out that low end and the frequencies that I don't want, and I don't have to find them every single time. And that's something I do with all of my drum libraries, or at least I'm building up each time I use them. I'm making sure I save the EQ that I use. On the cymbals, I have a similar thing, cutting out the resonant peaks of all of the cymbals, and I also want to boost a bit of high end so those cymbals ring out, and cut the low end so the cymbals are not boomy, because we usually associate cymbals with the high end. We don't want a lot of low end from the cymbals. From the overheads, I do a similar thing, because that's mostly the high end of the snare, and again, more cymbals, but I don't want things like the low end of the kick coming through on the overheads. That's just on this individual kick channel. And the same for the room, but I kind of want it to be a little bit more flat so I don't boost that high end. And so that's how I set up a standard drum kit sound, in particular with the Matt Halpin kit. And let's take a listen to what that sounds like in context at the end of this track. An additional element that we heard when we put that all together was some reverb and delays and echoes. So if we take a look at the sends of the drum kit, the toms and the snare are sending to some delays and some echo tracks. And for the snare echo, that's just a snare room reverb with a bit of EQ. That's cutting out the low end and cutting out a resonant frequency. And for the delay, that's just a standard Ableton delay. And let's hear a bit of what that sounds like. And that's just to add some ambience and space to the drum kit. I do a little bit more of that in the mixing stage, but we're going to get to the mixing of this track a little bit later in the video. For now, let's jump over to another track and take a look at Toward the Center, which is a track I produced for a local Canberra artist, System Strength. So earlier this year, I had the privilege of working with local Canberra artist on producing their debut album. It's called A Smell of Petroleum Prevails Throughout, and this track is called Towards the Center. I produced the whole album, and one of the main things that was involved in that was setting up drums for all of the tracks. So let's take a look at the drums for this track. Let me just drop it in from the start of verse 3. It sounds like this. Alright, so you can hear a bit of drums going on there. This was set up pretty much exactly the same way. I started with writing just one kit track, and then I separated out all the drum kit elements till we get this. If we take a look, for this one, I'm using the One Kit Wonder Metal Library. Now, the One Kit Wonder libraries are a little bit less flexible than the Matt Halpin signature pack, but they are still great to use and still really easy to mix individually. So all I've done here, this one is the kick track. You can see I've gone in and I've soloed the kick here. And it's just that simple. But I've also made sure that I've dropped out the overhead and the room sound. And I do the same for the snare. We go in here and here's something different. So for the snare on this track, I am actually using a different library. I'm using the Dry and Funky library. So it's a little bit not standard, but I wanted a different snare sound. So I've muted the kick, the toms, and I've soloed just the snare on the overhead. You can see on the overhead I've turned down these sounds. So the snare is being processed a little bit differently to everything else. The toms come again from the metal library, and to do that I mute the kick and the snare and the overheads in the room. So it's just those 4 toms that are going through on the mixer. And then for the overhead channel, I have knocked out the overheads on the snare because the snare is being processed separately, and then everything else is going through to the overheads. Sounds like this. And here the audio for the drums is being processed a little bit differently. So if we take a look at the kick, I have again a compressor, and I'm using this Ableton stock setup called Drums Warm and Wide, which I really like the sound of. I use it quite a bit. I think I might have tweaked it, but it's probably exactly how it comes stock preset. I just like the sound of it. And here on the EQ of the kick, I've done a similar thing. I've got a little bit of a boost here, which is the attack of the kick, and I've just gotten rid of some frequencies in the kick that I don't really like. For the snare, one of the requests I think I got was to have a little bit more punch in the snare the whole way through the track, and one of the easy ways to do that was just to drive the velocity a little bit harder. So whenever the snare is a little bit lower, this MIDI plugin here in Ableton is just going to boost the velocity up. Then for the snare we have a different One Kit Wonder library, and that is then running through a series of chains. Okay, I'm rediscovering this project file a little bit, and I worked out what this is. In an earlier version of the song in which this drum part here was used, which you can see is past the endpoint, when that was used I had some a bit crushed echo and a reverb, and those are not used in the track anymore. So we're just going to ignore that effect track and take a look. We've got a compressor, we've got drums warm and wide with a bit more stereo in the chorus and the final riff. One of the things that I wanted to do to really push that chorus, especially because if we take a look at the track, there's only really one chorus in the whole song. So to push that a little bit further, I increased the stereo wideness of the snare just for that section. Then I have the snare running through this EQ, which is doing nothing. And then I have it running through this channel snare plugin. Cool. I don't have an EQ cutting out any resonant frequencies of this snare because it's already incredibly dry out of the box in the Dry and Funky library. It sounds like this. No particularly harsh resonant frequencies in there, so I didn't bother. For the toms though, you can see here quite intense tom cutting, and that sounds like this on this little fill here. Same as before, if I get rid of that, if you're on headphones, you're going to hear a lot of boom coming from those toms. So that's what that is there for. And similar thing, the stereo enhancement on the toms in this section, a little bit higher. The overheads, very similar thing, just a little bit more stereo enhance. There you go. I also am sending all the drum parts in varying amounts to a drum room EQ, with a little bit of cut to the low end and to the high end. Let's now take a look at another track from this album called On the Road to This Place. Let's take a listen to the chorus of this song. Okay, so here we're dealing with a very similar setup to before, but with a few alterations. So firstly, one of the notes that I got was I was using this, again, One Kit Wonder metal, but the artist didn't really like the kick sound and thought it was a bit too clicky, and none of the drum libraries that I had a particularly good kick sound, so I'm just using a MIDI sample here of a kick that is a little bit more boomy and a little bit more what they liked the sound of. It sounds like this. Kind of open felt sound. So just like before, I would have written the whole drum part using One Kit Wonder metal, and then I copied the MIDI of just the kick across to this sample, and that's why we've got this kick individually. And again, just like before, cutting the resonant frequencies. Then the snare, the toms, the room, and the ride is where things get a little bit different because I don't like the ride of One Kit Wonder metal, or at least I didn't like it for this specific track. So I wanted to use a different ride symbol, and I really liked this Ableton stock kit called 64 Pad Kit Rock, and so I just have the ride from that pack. It sounds like this. And it blends fairly well with the One Kit Wonder metal kit, so altogether So as you can see, it's fairly easy to mix and match drum kit elements with these One Kit Wonder packs. I probably even wrote the ride cymbal part using One Kit Wonder Metal and then just switched it over to get a better sound. Let's look at one more track from this album. It's called Storm Boy. Again, let's take a listen to the chorus. Now, already you can probably see that our drums are looking a little bit different, and it's because they're not all the same color. And the reason for that is I really wanted to blend different kit elements for this track. So, for the kick, I'm using One Kit Wonder Metal. For the toms, I'm using One Kit Wonder Classic Rock. For the snare, I'm also using One Kit Wonder Metal. So we have just the overheads from the cymbals and toms coming from Classic Rock, and here we have just the overheads of the kick and the snare, which are coming from One Kit Wonder Metal. Altogether, it sounds like this. So a little bit of a different signal chain processing path. You can see very easy to blend in different kit elements. And similar processing chain, you can see the toms taking out those resonant frequencies. With the snare, we have a bit of a multi-band compression taking out some of the high end, some EQ taking out resonant frequencies, and we also have this lovely effect here. For this snare hit, I wanted, what is it? A phased delay. So for this sound, there's a snare sound, and it's going to echo out. And that's just for that one specific moment. The sends of the snare and the overhead of the snare, obviously, is being sent to this delay, which is also running through a thick phaser. So that's a look at how I process and program drums. Let's take a look at how I mix drums, and we're going to jump back to Connected, but part of something bigger from my upcoming album, Soul Trading. So once I'm happy with all the individual elements of a track, I will bounce them all out as audio files and then put them into a new project file just for mixing. And that way I can not worry about MIDI or anything like that. I already have all the parts that I wanted locked in. I'm just working on processing the audio and making all the layers blend together well. So this is what the mixed version of Connected but part of something bigger sounds like. Let's go from here. Whoa, big guitar echo there. So let's take a look at how I am processing the drums after I've locked in all the stems. Because we bounced out all those individual kit elements, we now have all the individual elements isolated. Kick, snare, toms, cymbals, overheads, and even the room, all individually processed. So what am I doing for the kick? Well, I'm taking out a lot of high end, and that's pretty much it, other than a little bit of additional compression from the CLA compressor. In this case, I had done a fair bit of EQ beforehand. Sometimes I do a little bit less EQ on the production side and then do more on the mixing side. In this case, I think it's a little bit of both, but here for the kick, we didn't have to do much to the EQ. The snare, I found another resonant frequency in the mixing stage, which always happens, and I wanted to do a little bit of mid-side EQ here, so the side has a lot less low end and the mid has a bit less high end. So just changing the stereo sound of the snare. I have a little bit of gain. There were a couple of hits that were a little bit too strong, and I've ducked the volume for those with some automation. And I also love this little plug-in here from Ableton to warm up highs, just to give a little bit of saturation to the high end of the snare. I'm also using this Transient Shaping Enhance. In the first part of the song, I have a lot more space to the snare, so the snare sound is longer, and then I want that a little bit tighter towards the end. So the transients are being shaped here with this device. A little bit of drive and crunch as well, and a little bit of compression, and a little bit more compression from a different compressor. This one here is just to make sure that any really hard attacks, any really strong peaks are cut down, and this one here is just to shape the sound overall. On the toms, just to really make sure I've cut out those resonant frequencies, I've copied the GGD Halpin Tom's EQ that we talked about earlier here, so that all those resonant frequencies are completely cut. And then I have a little bit more of a general EQ to bring up a little bit more low end. I have the same warm-up highs because I want the sound of the stick against the skin on the toms to be a little bit more saturated. That's what this is. I have a little bit of stereo width so that the toms, which are spread across their stereo space, I want them to be a little bit further spread to increase the stereo mix of the track. And then here, a little bit more compression. For the cymbals, all I'm doing is putting a little bit more compression on them, and again, widening the stereo field with this utility. The overheads, I have put the toms EQ because the toms are still going into the overhead mics. So this is there to cut out all of those resonant frequencies, even on the overheads. And also just a bit of mid-side EQ to make the side a little bit brighter with some more high-end, and the mids a little bit darker with a little bit less high-end, and also to get rid of the low-end on the sides. Then an overheads compressor, and for the drum room, a high pass and a compressor, and a sidechain EQ from the guitar. So whenever the guitar is being played, it's cutting out the drum room. And the reason for that is the guitar is a main element in this track that I wanted to cut through. And instead of cutting through and sidechaining the whole drum track, I just want to duck it a little bit. And the room is one element of the drum kit that kind of has everything and is also not super important to shaping the drum sound. It's important, but it is okay if that ducks and comes down a little bit. So to make the guitar cut through, I have it sidechaining the drum room. Then the whole drum sound is given a little bit of saturation, very tiny bit, which increases towards the end of the track to just makes the end of the track a little bit more powerful. And I have this mid-side EQ to make sure that the mids have a little bit more low end and not so much high end, and the sides the opposite. We're cutting all the low end on the side, so it's not going to mess up the stereo field, and also to make the high end a little bit brighter. I talked about widening the stereo field on the individual tracks, but I also I cut down the stereo wideness of the drum track at the beginning. You see it's only at 40%, and then by about halfway through the track, it's at regular panning, so a regular width. And then towards the very end, I increase it up to even 150 by the very end, so that the end feels like the drum track is just expanding out in the stereo space. And that's just a neat little trick that I've used there to make it feel like the track is growing over time. I also make sure that the beginning of the track is just completely silent, and that there's a fade out at the end. I also have a lot of sends for the drums in this track, so let's run through the sends. Everything is running through a drum bus, which is just Abbey Road TG mastering plugin from Waves Audio. I love this plugin and I love the presets. This is just the drum bus, just a drum bus preset that I think sounded good, and so everything is sent to that return track in varying amounts. The toms and the snare are sent to just this standard reverb with a high pass filter. Oh, and the snare is also sent to a delay as well. And also there's this tom smack, which is a drum bus effect from Ableton, which is just really making the toms really clicky. And then also there is more snare echo, which is just to make the snare echo. So we'll hear these sends. Let's take a listen to them in context. And these it's the tom smack and the snare echo that are really important, and that's affecting the toms and the snare. So let's take a listen. So early in the track, it's quite sparse in the arrangement, and so I want the snare to echo out a bit more. And I do that with this more snare echo, which is just a snare room and an EQ to cut out a resonant frequency. But I also have it going to a delay, that's this send, and also to a reverb the whole way through. And also, if you remember, I talked about, where is it? The snare, the transients on the snare are a bit wider, a bit longer rather, here in the beginning of the track, and then that comes down. Then the toms are getting sent to this tom smack, which sounds like this. Which you can hear is just a very tight sound on the toms, which I wanted to make sure the toms were kind of a bit clicky. I didn't want it to be the full tom sound, which is why it's a send, and I wanted a bit of that on the snare as well to make the snare really click out at this moment, and that's what this sounds like. So let's take a listen to the full drum kit sound from about halfway through so you can hear those changes in drum kit sound, and then maybe we'll listen to it with the full track. And let's just jump now to the end to hear how much wider it sounds. You can hear there at the end the drums are much wider because of that widening thing that I was talking about. You can see the drum kit is getting wider throughout the track. So let's listen to that all in context. So there you go, that's the full track mixed. I hope you enjoyed this video about how I process and mix drums. We looked at 4 tracks today, 3 of which are from System Strength's debut album, A Smell of Petroleum Prevails Throughout, which I produced, and another track from my upcoming album, Soul Trading. That song was called Connected, but part of something bigger. If you want to listen to the System Strength album, there are links down below where you can stream it and take a listen. And if you're interested in the Soul Trading album, it comes out on the 1st of December, so just a few days now until it comes out, and you can pre-order it on Bandcamp. If you pre-order or purchase on Bandcamp, there are 3 bonus tracks as well as some other extra goodies, so if you're interested in it, definitely check it out. I think it's worthwhile, and it helps to support me make the music that I make. If you like this video, be sure to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. I make videos like this where I break down my production occasionally, and if you have any elements of my production or my mixing or my mastering that you're interested in, leave a comment below and let me know, and maybe I'll get to it in a future video. That's all for now, so I guess I'll see you in the next one. Bye!